First, we will be talking about Robert Boyle. Boyle was born on January 25th of 1627 in Ireland. He was the youngest of 14 children, and he died on December 30th, 1691. He was the first scientist to publish his work, and he is known as the father of modern chemistry. His formula is P1V1 equals P2V2, and his law basically explains that as pressure is increased, the volume of the gas will decrease, and it is an inverse relationship. Robert Boyle's law is P1V1 equals P2V2. Okay, we're going to begin by identifying our initial pressure and volume and our change pressure and volume. So our initial, we know that it is 1.56. We will put that in parentheses. And it does multiply with the volume. It does multiply with the volume, and that is the volume. It's going to multiply with the pressure, which is 1. And then it will equal the second pressure and the second volume. And we do not have our second volume, so that's what we're trying to find. And it does have our second pressure, which is 3 atm. And we are trying to find that. Okay. After we have that set up, we're trying to get the V by itself, so we are dividing by 3. And the answer that we get here is going to equal the volume that we are trying to find. So let me just plug that in really quick. Which means that our volume will equal 0.52 liters. That is our answer, and we also consider using the significant figures. And that one has 1, and that one has 1. So and this is our example 2. We are going to start the same thing. We're just going to plug in the initial and the change. So we're going to start with the initial. Our pressure is 0.860 for the first one. So we're going to put that. And it is multiplied by 11.2, which is the initial volume. And it will equal our change in pressure, which is not there, so that is what we're trying to find, multiplied by our volume that we will end up having. And then we will do the same. We will divide both equations by 15. And we are trying to find our change in pressure. So whatever I get here is our pressure. We'll just plug it in here. Our pressure equals 0.6421. Our next scientist is Jacques Charles. Jacques Charles was born on November 23rd of 1746 in Beaugency, France, and he sadly died in 1823. His law basically states that as temperature increases, so does the volume. He was the first one to create the original hot air balloon, and his law or his formula is V1 over T1 equals V2 over T2, and the temperature does have to be in Kelvin, so we're going to get started with this example. So to start our first example for Charles' law, we first need to convert the Celsius into Kelvin, and to do that, all we have to do is add 273 to each. So our first one would be 300, and the second one would be 423, and then we just plug it into the equation. So our first volume would be 6 over the first temperature, which is 300, and it equals the one we're trying to look for, which is the volume 2, over 423. We then cross multiply, and we get 300x equals 2,538. To get the x by itself, which will equal our second volume, we'll divide it by 300, and that will give us 8.46. So our volume would equal 8.46 liters. And that is the answer to our first example. Second example, we're going to have to do the same as the first, and we will have to convert the 210 into Kelvin and the negative 23 into Kelvin. So our first one would end up being 483, and the second one would be having to end up with 250. And then we'll just plug it in as we did before. So our V1 is our first volume, which is 8 liters. And that will go over our first temperature, which is 483. And that equals our second volume, which is what we're trying to find, over our second temperature, which is 250. We will cross multiply, and that'll give us 483x equals 2000. We will then divide it by 483 to get our second volume, and that will be 4.14. And our second volume is 4.14 liters. And that is the answer to our second and final example.